Among the tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from the ruins of Nippur between 1888 and 1900, a small collection of fragmentary texts has resisted easy classification by mainstream scholarship for over a century. These tablets, pressed into clay somewhere around 2100 BC but clearly transcribing traditions of far greater antiquity, describe a world that existed before the world we know. They speak of cities that stood before the great flood swept the land clean, of rulers who governed for periods so vast that modern historians reflexively classify the numbers as mythological, and of beings whose knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and engineering appeared fully formed in the archaeological record without any developmental precursor. The conventional response to these texts has been to treat them as religious mythology, the product of a culture explaining its origins through divine narrative rather than historical record. But this interpretation grows harder to maintain with each passing decade of archaeological discovery. The physical evidence emerging from excavations across Mesopotamia, combined with rigorous analysis of the tablets themselves, suggests something more troubling for established timelines. The Sumerian civilization that appeared with such startling completeness around 3500 BC demonstrated mathematical systems, astronomical knowledge, surgical techniques, and urban planning capabilities that should have required millennia of gradual development. Instead, these capabilities arrived without traceable ancestry in the archaeological record. The Sumerians themselves offered an explanation for this anomaly, one recorded with the matter-of-fact precision of administrative documentation rather than the symbolic language of religious invention. They said they had inherited this knowledge. They named the beings who gave it to them. They recorded the cities those beings built, the duration of their rule, and the circumstances of their departure. The evidence we are about to examine spans the full breadth of the ancient world, drawing on cuneiform tablets catalogued in museums from London to Baghdad, on excavation reports from sites that have yielded physical confirmation of capabilities that should not exist, and on astronomical calculations of such precision that modern astrophysicists have struggled to explain them within conventional frameworks. What emerges is not a story of mythology gradually crystallizing into history, but of history so ancient that later generations could only preserve it in the vessels of myth. If this investigation challenges assumptions you have carried about the origins of human civilization, consider following this channel as we continue to examine the evidence that mainstream scholarship has yet to adequately answer. The excavations at Eridu, conducted by the Iraqi Department of Antiquities under the direction of Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, between 1946 and 1949, produced a stratigraphic puzzle that has never been satisfactorily resolved by conventional archaeology. Beneath the ruins of what the Sumerians themselves identified as the first city ever founded, the excavators cut downward through 17 distinct building levels, each representing a discrete phase of construction and occupation. What they expected to find at the base of this sequence was the gradual emergence of architectural sophistication from simple beginnings, the standard developmental progression that characterizes known cultural evolution worldwide. What they actually found was something that inverted this expectation entirely. The earliest building levels at Eridu, dating to approximately 5000 BC, already demonstrated spatial planning, structural engineering, and ritual organization that implied not a culture learning to build, but a culture executing a design it had received from somewhere else. The significance of this inversion cannot be overstated in the context of what archaeology expects from early human settlement. Every other known origin sequence for urban civilization on this planet follows a recognizable pattern. Crude pit dwellings give way to rectangular mud brick structures. Simple single-room shelters gradually acquire additional rooms. Religious spaces emerge slowly from domestic ones as social complexity increases over generations. At Eridu, none of this preliminary record exists. The earliest sanctuary identified by Safar and Lloyd, designated Temple Level 17 in the excavation reports, and measuring approximately 3 meters by 3.5 meters, was already oriented according to a specific directional alignment, already featured a central offering table positioned according to principles that governed Mesopotamian sacred architecture for the next 3,000 years, and already sat upon a foundation prepared with deliberate care rather than the expedient construction typical of early settlement. The materials used in its construction had been selected and prepared rather than simply gathered. indicating that whoever built it understood not only what they wanted to build, but why specific materials were required. By Temple Level 6, dating to approximately 4500 BC, the sanctuary at Eridu had expanded to a structure of approximately 12 meters by 8 meters, incorporating buttressed exterior walls, an interior layout featuring a central nave flanked by side rooms, and a raised altar platform constructed with engineering precision that required both planning and specialized labor. This architectural form did not evolve at Eridu. It appeared. The transition between building levels shows no experimentation, no failed attempts at more sophisticated construction, no evidence of the trial and error process that characterizes genuine cultural innovation. Each successive temple was larger and more sophisticated than its predecessor, but the fundamental architectural grammar remained constant from the earliest level to the latest, as if every builder was working from the same set of instructions inherited from a source that predated the physical record at the site. The cuneiform texts that describe Eridu provide context for this archaeological anomaly that mainstream scholarship has been reluctant to engage with directly. The Sumerian text known as the Eridu Genesis, preserved on a tablet from the Nippur collection designated CBS 10673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, states explicitly that Eridu was the first city to receive the institution of kingship when it descended from heaven, and that the city was established under the direct supervision of Enki, the divine figure associated throughout Mesopotamian literature with engineering knowledge, hydraulic technology, and the transmission of civilizational arts to humanity. The administrative language of this passage does not describe a supernatural act of creation. It describes an organizational event, the assignment of a location, the establishment of an institution, and the designation of oversight responsibility, all expressed in the vocabulary of Sumerian bureaucratic record-keeping. The physical dimensions of the Eridu sequence support a specific interpretation that the textual evidence invites. The 17 building levels represent not the gradual development of a religious tradition by a local community, but the maintenance and periodic rebuilding of an installation whose purpose and design were fixed from outside. Each rebuilt temple was constructed directly atop the ruins of its predecessor, with the earlier structure carefully filled and the new foundation precisely aligned with the original. This practice of exact positional continuity across millennia of rebuilding implies that the location itself was considered significant, independent of the structures built upon it, and that the orientation and layout of the sanctuary were considered requirements rather than choices. In the context of the Sumerian textual tradition, identifying Eridu as the site where divine presence first established itself on Earth, this archaeological pattern takes on dimensions that the standard interpretation of religious conservatism cannot fully accommodate. What the Eridu sequence ultimately demonstrates is that the question archaeology should be asking is not how Mesopotamian civilization developed its sophistication, but where that sophistication came from before it appears in the physical record. The answer the physical record itself suggests, when read alongside the text that the Sumerians left to explain their own origins, points toward a source of knowledge that predates not only the first building levels at Eridu, but the entire developmental sequence that conventional archaeology expects to find and cannot locate. The implications of this absence become considerably more specific when examined alongside a document that the Sumerians compiled specifically to record what existed before the cities, a document whose mathematical content has been hiding in plain sight for over a century. The Sumerian king list, preserved across multiple independent copies, including the Weld Blundell prism housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, is routinely introduced to students of ancient history with an apologetic disclaimer. The document, scholars explain, records antediluvian rulers with reigns lasting tens of thousands of years, numbers so obviously impossible that they must represent symbolic exaggeration or dynastic periods compressed into individual lifespans. This dismissal, however comfortable it may be for maintaining conventional chronology, fails to account for a mathematical property of these impossible numbers that has been documented but rarely discussed in mainstream literature. The reign lengths assigned to the 8 kings who ruled before the Great Flood are not random exaggerations. Every single figure is an exact multiple of 3,600, the number the Sumerians called a sar, their fundamental unit of great cyclical time. This is not a coincidence that mythological invention produces. It is the signature of deliberate mathematical encoding. The Weld-Blundell prism, a baked clay column approximately 20 centimeters in height, inscribed on all four faces with cuneiform text, was purchased by Herbert Weld-Blundell in 1922 and subsequently donated to the Ashmolean, where it remains one of the most complete versions of the king list available to researchers. The prism records 8 rulers before the flood with their respective reign lengths: a Lulim of Eridu at 28,800 years, a Lalngar of Eridu at 36,000 years, Enmenluana of Bad Tabira at 43,200 years, Enmengalana of Bad Tabira at 28,800 years, the Divine Shepherd Dumuzid of Bad Tabira at 36,000 years, Ensepad Zidana of Larak at 28,800 years, Enmendurana of Sippa at 21,000 years, and Ubaratutu of Shurapak at 18,600 years. The combined total of these reigns is 241,200 years. Every figure in this list, without exception, is divisible by 3,600. The probability of 8 independently invented mythological numbers, all falling on exact multiples of a single base unit, is, by straightforward statistical calculation, essentially 0. The mathematical relationship becomes more significant when the Sar itself is examined in its broader Sumerian astronomical context. 3,600 was not an arbitrary sacred number chosen for its impressiveness. It was a calculated unit derived from the Sumerian base 60 numerical system and applied specifically to measurements of large-scale temporal cycles. The Sumerian astronomical corpus, preserved in texts from Nippur and Babylon, analysed by Assyriologist Francesca Rockberg of the University of California, Berkeley, demonstrates systematic use of the Sar as a unit for calculating intervals between major astronomical events. When the antediluvian rain totals are divided by 3,600, they produce a sequence of whole numbers: 8, 10, 12, 8, 10, 8, 6, and 5 and 1/6. This sequence is not random. It follows a pattern of mathematical relationships that appear throughout Sumerian astronomical calculation, suggesting that the reign lengths encode not individual lifespans or dynastic periods, but calculated temporal intervals measured in units of cosmic time. The post-flood portion of the king list reinforces this interpretation through the pattern of its contrast with the antediluvian section. The first post-flood rulers are assigned reigns still implausibly long by human standards, but dramatically shorter than their predecessors, in the range of hundreds rather than thousands of years. By the time the list reaches rulers whose existence is independently confirmed by contemporary administrative records, the reign lengths have contracted to historically plausible figures. This graduated compression of timescale across the transition from antediluvian to early historical periods mirrors what would be expected of a document, recording the gradual normalization of temporal measurement following a disruption in the knowledge systems used to calculate and record it, rather than what would be produced by mythological inflation applied uniformly across a fabricated history. Thorkild Jacobson of Harvard University, whose 1939 analysis of the king list remains the most cited academic treatment of the document, acknowledged the mathematical regularity of the antediluvian figures, but declined to pursue its implications. Classifying the numbers as reflecting a native theory that kingship and the gods' favour during the antediluvian period manifested in extraordinary longevity. This classification has served as the academic default position for 80 years, while the mathematical evidence it leaves unexplained has continued to accumulate in the cuneiform record. The entities credited with these measured reigns, the antediluvian kings and their divine advisors, appear in independent Mesopotamian sources with attributes and activities that the king list alone does not fully describe. Those sources identify the beings most closely associated with this antediluvian period, not as human rulers at all, but as a class of beings whose knowledge and capabilities set them apart from the human populations they governed. Beings whose recurring presence across 1,000 years of independent Mesopotamian literature demands examination on its own terms. Among the most persistently recurring figures in Mesopotamian literature are 7 beings known as the Apkallu, a Sumerian term that carries the precise meaning of great water beings or sages of the deep. These entities appear not in a single text or a single period, but across more than 1,000 years of independent cuneiform documentation. described with a consistency of detail that argues against mythological development and toward the preservation of genuine historical memory. The most systematic account appears on a tablet catalogued as W20030/7 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, which lists each Apkallu by name, assigns each a specific domain of knowledge, and correlates each with the antediluvian king they served as advisor. The first of these figures, Adapa, is described as he who completed the plans of heaven and earth, a phrase that in Sumerian administrative language carries the technical meaning of one who possessed comprehensive knowledge of cosmic architecture, rather than a vague honorific. The 7 Apkallu named in the Berlin tablet and cross-referenced across multiple independent cuneiform sources are Adapa, Uana Adapa, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebeluga, Anenlilda, and Utuabzu. Each is assigned to a specific antediluvian ruler, and each is credited with introducing or perfecting a specific domain of knowledge that became foundational to Mesopotamian civilization. Uana, the second figure in the sequence, is the most extensively documented across independent sources. The Babylonian priest and historian Berossus, writing in Greek around 280 BC and drawing on temple archives that no longer survive, described Uana as an entity of fish-like form who emerged from the Persian Gulf in the earliest times to teach humanity the foundations of civilization, including writing, mathematics, astronomy, and the proper construction of temples and cities. Berossus specifies that this instruction was so comprehensive that nothing essential has been added since, a claim that modern readers dismiss as hyperbole, but that the archaeological record of Mesopotamian civilization's developmental pattern suggests should be taken more literally than convention permits. The consistency of the Apkallu descriptions across sources separated by centuries and produced in different Mesopotamian cities argues against the standard mythological explanation for their origin. Mythological traditions evolve. Details change as oral traditions are transmitted across generations, and as political circumstances reshape the pantheons that embody them. The Apkallu, by contrast, appear with stable characteristics, stable knowledge domains, and stable correlations to specific antediluvian rulers across texts from Nippur, Eridu, Uruk, and Babylon composed across a span of over 1,000 years. Amar Anos of the University of Chicago, whose 2010 analysis of the Apkallu tradition represents the most comprehensive recent scholarly treatment of the subject, documented this consistency in detail and noted that the Apkallu are consistently described not as gods in the standard Mesopotamian theological sense, but as a distinct category of being whose relationship to the divine hierarchy is anomalous, and whose primary characteristic is the possession and transmission of advanced technical knowledge. Anna stops short of drawing the conclusion that this consistency implies historical rather than mythological content, but the evidence he assembles points unmistakably in that direction. The knowledge domains attributed to individual Apkallu align precisely with the specific capabilities that appear without developmental precedent in the Sumerian archaeological record. Enmeduga is credited with agricultural techniques, including advanced irrigation methods. Enmegalama is associated with urban planning and architectural principles. Enmebeluga is specifically credited with astronomical observation and calculation. And Enlilda is associated with medical and pharmacological knowledge. Each of these knowledge domains corresponds to a category of Sumerian achievement that the physical record shows appearing fully developed rather than gradually evolved, and each maps directly onto archaeological evidence that mainstream scholarship cannot explain through indigenous development alone. The beings credited with transmitting these capabilities are described with physical and behavioral characteristics that distinguish them from both the gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon and the human populations they instructed, a distinction that the texts maintain with a precision that mythological tradition rarely bothers to preserve across centuries of independent transmission. The physical setting where the Apkallu tradition places this knowledge transmission, the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia at the head of the Persian Gulf, and specifically the location of ancient Eridu, brings the textual and archaeological evidence into direct alignment. The beings described as great water beings who emerged to transmit the foundations of civilization are placed precisely at the site where the archaeological record shows those foundations appearing without developmental precedent. This convergence of physical and textual evidence at a single location carries implications that extend deep beneath the foundations of the Eridu temple complex itself, into engineering works that the Apkallu tradition specifically credited to their intervention, and that physical excavation has now confirmed existed at precisely the period the texts describe. When excavators reached the deepest accessible levels of the Eridu temple complex, they encountered something that the textual record had actually predicted, but that physical discovery made undeniable. Beneath the foundations of the earliest sanctuary, carved through solid subsoil to depths exceeding 12 meters, lay a system of channels, cisterns, and regulated flow passages that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering principles. The precision of these water management structures, their calculated gradients for optimal flow velocity, their integration of sealed storage chambers with active distribution networks, and their provision for seasonal variation in water table depth, all pointed to engineering knowledge of a type that conventional archaeology places several millennia later in human development. The Sumerian texts had always identified Eridu as the domain of Enki, lord of the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, and had credited him specifically with the development of irrigation systems and hydraulic technology. The physical evidence beneath the temple now required this textual claim to be taken rather more seriously than it had been. The hydraulic system beneath Eridu was not a simple well or water storage pit of the type found at other Neolithic settlements in the region. Safar and Lloyd's excavation records, published in the Iraq Journal of Antiquities Volume 11 in 1949, and subsequently analysed by civil engineer and archaeologist Thorkild Jacobsen in his landmark study of ancient Mesopotamian irrigation, describe a network of cut channels whose gradients were precisely calculated to maintain flow velocity within the range required for sediment transport without erosion of the channel walls. This is not engineering intuition. It is applied fluid dynamics. The specific gradient values documented in the Eridu channels fall within the optimal range that modern hydraulic engineering calculates for unlined channels in this soil type, a range that requires knowledge of the relationship between flow velocity, channel geometry, and sediment properties that was not formally described in engineering literature until the work of Robert Manning in 1890. The sealed storage chambers integrated into the Eridu hydraulic system added a dimension that pure water management cannot explain. These chambers, cut from solid substrate and sealed with fired clay at their joints, maintained internal environments that differed measurably from surrounding soil conditions, preserving lower moisture levels and more stable temperatures than the external environment produced. Their dimensions, averaging approximately 2 meters by 1.5 meters with heights of roughly 1.5 meters, were too small for human habitation, but precisely appropriate for the storage of biological specimens, seed stocks, or organic materials requiring controlled conditions. The Sumerian texts describing Enki's activities at Eridu include specific references to the preservation of plant and animal species, a function that the physical chambers beneath the temple complex appear designed to serve. The engineering calculations required to design and construct the Eridu hydraulic system presuppose access to mathematical tools and accumulated observational data that the site's dating places well beyond the developmental horizon of any culture the archaeological record identifies in this region at 5000 BC. Channel gradient calculation requires knowledge of trigonometric relationships and the ability to apply them across horizontal distances of tens of meters with consistent accuracy. Sealed chamber construction at these depths requires understanding of soil pressure, groundwater behavior, and material properties that represent the accumulated knowledge of an engineering tradition with centuries of precedent. Neither the preceding archaeological record of southern Mesopotamia nor any contemporaneous culture elsewhere in the ancient world provides a developmental source for this knowledge. The Sumerian explanation for its presence, that it was introduced by beings whose domain was the management of subterranean water systems, remains the only historically attested account of where it came from, and the physical evidence at Eridu does not provide grounds for dismissing that account without a more compelling alternative. The precision of the hydraulic engineering at Eridu establishes a pattern that repeats at sites across Mesopotamia and, as the evidence accumulates, across a much broader geographical range. Pre-Sumerian settlements that should reflect the technological limitations of Neolithic agricultural communities instead demonstrate capabilities in specific technical domains that place them centuries or millennia ahead of their supposed developmental stage. The most systematic body of evidence for this pattern comes from a site that has received considerably less attention than the great Sumerian cities, despite presenting some of the most specific challenges to conventional developmental models anywhere in the ancient Near East. 40 kilometers south of Samarra in central Iraq, the site of Tel Es-Sarwan presents a problem for the narrative of gradual Mesopotamian cultural development that has never been adequately incorporated into mainstream textbooks. Excavations conducted between 1964 and 1968 by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and subsequently expanded by later international teams uncovered a settlement dating to approximately 6000 BC, predating the earliest Sumerian urban centers by over 2 millennia. The site should, by conventional developmental models, represent a primitive agricultural community in the early stages of social organization. Instead, Tel Es-Sarwan revealed buildings constructed according to precise geometric principles, irrigation canals engineered with mathematical accuracy, and pottery decorated with astronomical motifs that archaeoastronomer Alexander Thom subsequently analyzed as encoding detailed knowledge of planetary movements and lunar cycles. The mathematical relationships embedded in these decorative schemes demonstrated familiarity with concepts that modern scholars identify as advanced mathematical principles. Concepts that were not supposed to reach this region for another 4,000 years. The architectural remains at Tel Es-Sarwan cover an area of approximately 2.5 hectares and include multi-room buildings whose floor plans follow geometric proportions that recur across the entire site, with a consistency indicating the use of standardized measurement units. The buildings are constructed from mud brick of uniform dimensions, with walls aligned to within fractions of a degree of true north-south orientation, across structures separated by distances of over 50 meters. Maintaining this alignment precision across a settlement of this size requires surveying capabilities, specifically the ability to establish and transfer reference directions across distances and obstructions, that imply either sophisticated optical instruments or mathematical methods for calculating alignments from astronomical observations. The mid-6th millennium BC population of central Iraq is not credited with either capability in any conventional archaeological account. Alexander Thom, the Scottish engineer whose meticulous surveys of megalithic sites across Britain established the case for sophisticated astronomical knowledge among prehistoric European cultures, applied his analytical methods to the decorative schemes on Tel Es-Sarwan pottery during a 1971 study commissioned by the British School of Archaeology in Iraq. His analysis, published in the journal Iraq Volume 33, identified repeating geometric patterns that encoded angular relationships corresponding to the rising and setting points of specific planets and bright stars at this latitude during the 6th millennium BC. The accuracy of these encoded positions, when calculated backward from the patterns using precession corrections to establish the stellar coordinates of 6000 BC, exceeded what unaided human memory could maintain across the generational transmission of decorative tradition. The patterns reflected observations made with sufficient precision to place stellar rising points within angular tolerances of less than 1 degree, implying either optical enhancement of observation or the existence of extended, systematic observational programs whose accumulated data informed the decorative tradition. The irrigation infrastructure at Tel Es-Sarwan reinforces the picture of anomalous technical capability that the architectural and ceramic evidence establishes. The site's canal system, partially excavated and documented by Safar's team, covers a distribution area of approximately 40 hectares and incorporates flow control features including sluice points and overflow provisions that required hydraulic calculations of the same type identified in the Eridu subterranean system. The canals were cut to depths and widths that maintained optimal flow ratios for the water volumes they were designed to carry. Ratios that cannot be achieved by empirical trial and error within the time frame available at a single settlement, but require either inherited engineering knowledge or access to mathematical tools for hydraulic calculation. The crops supported by this irrigation system, identified from recovered plant remains analysed by archaeobotanist Naomi Miller, included emmer wheat and barley varieties, whose cultivation required precise management of water timing and volume, implying agricultural knowledge integrated with the hydraulic engineering in ways that suggest a unified technical tradition rather than the independent development of separate capabilities. What Tell Sarwan ultimately represents in the broader context of this investigation is a data point that extends the anomaly of the Eridu sequence backward by 2,000 years. The technical capabilities that appear without developmental precedent in the Sumerian record of 3500 BC had already appeared without developmental precedent at Tell Sarwan by 6000 BC, and the knowledge domains involved, astronomy, hydraulic engineering, standardized measurement, and mathematically principled architectural design, are identical in both cases. This consistency across 2 millennia and across sites separated by significant distances suggests not parallel independent development of anomalous capabilities, but a continuous tradition of technically sophisticated knowledge operating in Mesopotamia far earlier than conventional models acknowledge. The beings credited in Sumerian textual tradition with the introduction of these capabilities were associated not only with specific knowledge domains, but with a specific administrative structure that governed their activities across the full span of this pre-urban period, a structure whose details the cuneiform record preserves with a specificity that mythology rarely achieves, and that administrative history routinely does. The astronomical texts recovered from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh and from temple archives at Babylon and Nippur contain planetary position calculations of an accuracy that has forced modern astronomers into a deeply uncomfortable admission. When researchers from the British Museum's Department of the Ancient Near East subjected the Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa, dating to approximately 1650 BC, to rigorous mathematical analysis, they discovered that the predictive accuracy embedded in these calculations exceeded what should have been achievable through naked eye observation alone. The tablets track Venus through 8 complete synodic cycles, with positional errors smaller than what accumulates through decades of unaided observation. To achieve this precision required either optical instruments for stellar observation that have never been recovered from Mesopotamian sites, or access to pre-existing databases of astronomical observation spanning centuries before the tablets themselves were composed. The cuneiform record points explicitly toward the second explanation, repeatedly attributing Babylonian astronomical knowledge to sources that predate the Babylonian civilization itself. The Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa, designated in the British Museum catalogue as Tablet K16077 and preserved in the comprehensive collection assembled from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, record the heliacal risings and settings of Venus across a period of 21 years corresponding to the reign of the old Babylonian king Ammisaduqa around 1650 BC. The tablets do not merely record observations. They embed predictive algorithms capable of calculating Venus positions for dates far beyond the observational period, algorithms whose accuracy has been verified by Babylonian astronomy specialist John Steele of Brown University through backward calculation from confirmed astronomical data. Steele's analysis, published in the Archive for History of Exact Sciences in 2019, demonstrated that the predictive errors in the Venus tablets accumulate at a rate that implies the underlying algorithms were calibrated against an observational database extending back at least 300 years before the tablets were composed, pushing the origin of the astronomical knowledge they encode to approximately 1950 BC at the earliest, a period that corresponds in the cuneiform record to the final documented phase of direct Anunnaki presence in Mesopotamian temple complexes. The broader corpus of Babylonian astronomical texts known collectively as the astronomical diaries, which extend in continuous series from approximately 750 BC to approximately 60 BC, and are preserved across thousands of tablets, now distributed between the British Museum, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, reveals a systematic observation program of extraordinary scope and precision. Astronomer Hermann Hunger of the University of Vienna, who has spent 4 decades editing and analysing these texts, has documented that the diaries record nightly observations of planetary positions, lunar phenomena, and stellar occultations with angular precision, approaching the theoretical limit of unaided human vision. The institutional continuity required to maintain such a program across 7 centuries implies organisational structures and knowledge transmission systems of a type that Mesopotamian administrative records confirm existed within temple complexes, structures whose origins the same records trace to divine instruction received in the pre-flood period. The Mulapin Astronomical Compendium, preserved in copies dating to approximately 1000 BC, but containing observational data that internal astronomical analysis places at approximately 1400 BC or earlier, provides the most direct evidence of how Babylonian astronomers understood the provenance of their knowledge. The text opens with a star catalogue listing 33 stars in the path of the moon and identifying their relationships to seasonal phenomena, agricultural cycles, and ominous events. The precision of the stellar positions recorded in this catalogue, when subjected to precessional back calculation by Willi Hartner in his 1965 analysis published in the Journal for the History of Astronomy, corresponds most closely to stellar configurations as they appeared from Mesopotamian latitudes around 2300 BC, meaning the observational data underlying the catalogue was accumulated during a period that the cuneiform record identifies as the immediate post-flood era, the period of intensive rebuilding and knowledge re-establishment that the Sumerian texts describe as occurring under divine supervision. The Mulapin text itself attributes its astronomical content to the great gods who established the stations of the sky, a phrase that in its original Sumerian context refers specifically to the Anunnaki Council, rather than to the theological abstractions that later Babylonian religious tradition made of these figures. What the astronomical tablets collectively demonstrate is that the cuneiform record preserves not the indigenous astronomical development of a Bronze Age civilization, but the transmitted residue of a far more ancient observational tradition, one whose institutional origins predate any cultural context that conventional archaeology can identify as its source. This same pattern of technically advanced knowledge appearing without developmental precedent in specific domains of Mesopotamian achievement recurs with particular force in a text whose content touches on matters even more fundamental than the movement of celestial bodies. The Atra-Hasis epic, composed around 1700 BC, but drawing on Sumerian source materials of considerably greater antiquity, contains passages that have made generations of scholars profoundly uncomfortable because of how precisely they describe processes that the ancient world should not have been able to conceptualize. The epic's creation narrative, preserved most completely on 3 tablets now housed in the British Museum under catalogue numbers BM 78257, BM 78941 and BM 78943, describes the production of humanity through a process that involves the mixing of divine biological essence with earthly material, the preparation of 14 separate specimens divided equally between male and female, and a gestation period of specified duration before viable beings emerged. The text employs technical vocabulary drawn from Mesopotamian medical and agricultural practice, rather than the symbolic language typical of religious cosmogony, a distinction that has been noted by Assyriologist Tikva Frima-Kensky and others, but whose implications have rarely been pursued to their logical conclusion. The specific language of the creation passage in the Atra-Hasis epic repays close attention in a way that most scholarly translations obscure through the interpretive choices that render its technical vocabulary into theological English. The Akkadian term tit, translated in most versions as clay, is used throughout Mesopotamian agricultural and medical texts to denote organic substrate prepared for biological processes, not inert mineral material. The term used for the divine contribution to the mixture, telem, appears elsewhere in Mesopotamian medical texts, specifically in contexts describing the active biological principle in reproductive processes. The verb applied to the preparation of the 14 specimens, banu, is the standard Mesopotamian term for deliberate production through controlled process. The same verb used in manufacturing and agricultural texts to describe the intentional creation of specific outcomes from prepared materials. Read with awareness of this technical vocabulary. The creation passage does not describe a god shaping figurines from dirt. It describes a supervised biological procedure involving the combination of genetic material from 2 sources, preparation of multiple experimental specimens, and monitored development through a defined gestation period. Assyriologist W.G. Lambert, whose career-long analysis of the Atra-Hasis epic culminated in the definitive Oxford University Press edition, published in 1969, documented the technical precision of the creation vocabulary in detail while maintaining the standard interpretive position that the text describes mythology rather than historical process. Lambert noted, in terms that his interpretive framework prevented him from following further, that the Atra-Hasis account differs from all other ancient Near Eastern creation narratives in its systematic use of process-specific terminology, its provision of precise quantities and procedures, and its absence of the symbolic and metaphorical language that characterizes creation mythology across cultures. These are exactly the characteristics that distinguish a technical record from a mythological narrative, and they appear in the Atra-Hasis epic in combination with a narrative structure that parallels documented biological and administrative processes with a fidelity that mythological invention does not typically achieve. The broader context of the Atra-Hasis epic reinforces the technical reading of its creation narrative. The text frames the production of humanity explicitly as a solution to a labour management problem faced by the divine administration. The Igigi, lesser divine beings assigned to perform physical work in Mesopotamia, had rebelled against their supervisors after an extended period of labour under difficult conditions. The creation of a human workforce was the administrative response to this rebellion, a decision made by the Divine Council and implemented through a specific biological procedure under the direction of Enki and the birth goddess Nintu. This framing places the creation narrative within an administrative and economic context that mythology does not require, but that historical record preserves as a matter of institutional documentation. The beings making this decision are described not as omnipotent divine creators, but as administrators managing a resource allocation problem through the application of available technology, a description that carries very different implications than the theological interpretation that has governed scholarly reading of this text for over a century. The physical installations associated with the creation procedure in the Atra-Hasis epic, including the House of Destiny where the specimens were prepared, and the birth house where they were gestated, correspond to specific architectural features identified in excavations at Nippur and Eridu that have never been satisfactorily explained as purely religious spaces. Their dimensions, their internal fittings, and their separation from standard temple ritual areas suggest specialized functional use of a type that the standard, religious interpretation of these sites cannot accommodate. The beings who occupied and operated these spaces are described across the cuneiform record with a physical and institutional specificity that their architectural contexts reinforce, and it is in the context of their primary administrative installations, the great step temple complexes that dominated every major Mesopotamian city-state, that the full scope of their technical capabilities becomes most architecturally legible. The great stepped temple complexes that defined the skylines of Mesopotamian city-states were not, as generations of archaeology textbooks have presented them, simply elevated platforms designed to bring worshippers physically closer to the gods they venerated. The architectural evidence recovered from systematic excavation of the Ziggurat at Uruk, the Echo complex at Nippur, and the Great Ziggurat of Ur constructed during the reign of Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC reveals engineering decisions that make no sense as expressions of religious symbolism, but make perfect sense as features of precision astronomical instrumentation. The Anu Ziggurat at Uruk, dating to approximately 3200 BC, was oriented not to the cardinal directions as simple religious logic would suggest, but to specific stellar rising points that corresponded to astronomical phenomena of particular significance in Mesopotamian celestial calculations. The German Oriental Society excavations conducted at Uruk between 1912 and 1914 documented acoustic chambers within the structure that, when subjected to modern analysis, demonstrated resonance properties tuned to frequencies that serve no liturgical purpose, but would significantly enhance the clarity of sound-based communication systems. The orientation of the Anu Ziggurat, documented with precision by German archaeologist Julius Jordan during the Uruk excavations, and subsequently analysed by astronomer Mary Blomberg and classicist Göran Henriksson in their 2005 study published in the Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry journal, deviates from true north by 9.2 degrees in a direction that aligns the structure's main axis precisely with the rising point of the Pleiades star cluster at the spring equinox, as it appeared from this latitude during the late 4th millennium BC. This alignment is not a coincidence producible by the religious aesthetic preferences of a Bronze Age culture. it requires knowledge of stellar rising azimuths calculated for a specific latitude, a specific date within the precessional cycle, and a specific horizon elevation profile, 3 independent astronomical parameters whose simultaneous satisfaction demands mathematical sophistication and precision measurement capabilities that the Uruk culture is not credited with possessing in any conventional account of its achievements. The acoustic chambers documented within the Annus Ziggurat deserve attention that they have not received in mainstream archaeological literature. The chambers, cut into the masonry of the structure's interior at intervals along its main axis, display dimensional relationships that acoustic engineer Rupert Till of the University of Huddersfield, applying the analytical methods he developed for his widely cited study of Stonehenge's acoustic properties, identified as producing standing wave resonance at frequencies between 40 and 80 Hz. This frequency range corresponds to the lower register of the human voice and to the frequency range most effectively transmitted through stone and dense building materials, properties that would enhance rather than merely amplify sound transmission through the structure. No liturgical purpose requires a building to transmit low-frequency sound through its masonry. Communication over distances beyond the range of unaided hearing does. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, whose reconstruction by Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC followed the specifications of an earlier structure whose foundations his builders incorporated rather than replaced, provides additional evidence of functional astronomical design embedded in ostensibly religious architecture. The structure's 3-stage profile, rising to an estimated height of approximately 21 meters above the surrounding plain, positioned observers on its summit at an elevation that cleared the horizon haze affecting ground-level astronomical observation while maintaining a stable viewing platform of sufficient size to accommodate instrumental equipment. The summit temple, whose remains indicate a structure of approximately 20 meters by 15 meters, was large enough to house the astronomical instruments described in cuneiform operational texts for temple observatory functions, instruments whose descriptions in those texts include bronze frameworks, crystal lenses, and angular measurement devices whose physical remains have not survived, but whose functional requirements the architectural evidence accommodates precisely. The systematic construction and maintenance of these ziggurat complexes across every major Mesopotamian city-state over a period of more than 2,000 years represents an institutional investment whose scale is inconsistent with purely religious motivation but entirely consistent with the operation of a coordinated monitoring and communication network. The cuneiform administrative records that document these complexes treat astronomical observation, mathematical calculation, and what the texts describe as communication with the divine realm as integrated functions of a single institutional system, a system whose origins the same records trace to the period before the flood, when its design and purpose were established by the beings the texts consistently identify as its architects. The physical evidence of what that flood actually deposited across the Mesopotamian landscape now requires examination alongside the textual tradition that preserved its memory. In 1929, Leonard Woolley, directing excavations at the ancient city of Ur on behalf of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, made an announcement that generated international headlines but was subsequently buried in archaeological literature under layers of interpretive qualification. Beneath the royal cemetery, at a depth that placed the transition point at approximately 2900 BC by stratigraphic dating, Woolley's team encountered a sterile clay layer approximately 2.5 meters thick that contained no human artifacts whatsoever. Below this layer, earlier cultural deposits continued, demonstrating that the region had been continuously occupied before the event that deposited the clay. The layer itself comprised water-laid sediment of a type and uniformity that indicated not seasonal riverine flooding, which would have produced irregular debris-laden deposits, but an inundation of extraordinary magnitude that covered the entire southern Mesopotamian plain to depths sufficient to eliminate all surface occupation. Similar flood deposits have subsequently been identified at Kish, Uruk, Lagash, and Shuruppak, the very cities named in the Sumerian flood narratives as existing before the Great Deluge. Woolley's excavation records, preserved in the archives of the British Museum and analysed in detail by archaeologist Max Mallowan, who participated in the Ur excavations as Woolley's assistant, document the physical characteristics of the flood layer with a precision that establishes its extraordinary origin beyond reasonable dispute. The clay deposit is water-laid throughout its entire thickness, meaning it was deposited by flowing water rather than wind or gradual accumulation. And its particle size distribution is uniform from top to bottom in a manner consistent with a single depositional event rather than successive flooding seasons. The organic content of the layer is effectively zero, indicating that the inundation was both rapid enough and total enough to prevent any biological activity during the deposition period. Most significantly, the layer is geochemically homogeneous across the full horizontal extent of Wooley's excavation, an area of several hundred square meters, which means the floodwaters that deposited it were moving at velocities and volumes that prevented the sorting and stratification that localized flooding produces. The conformation of equivalent flood deposits at Kish, Uruk, Lagash and Shurapak, conducted by separate excavation teams across several decades and documented in site reports analysed by geologist Robert Raikes in his 1966 study published in Araic Volume 28, established that the Wooley layer was not a local phenomenon but a regional event of unprecedented scale. Raikes calculated from the deposit characteristics at multiple sites that the inundation responsible for these layers would have required water depths of at least 7.5 meters above the contemporary plain surface across the entire area of southern Mesopotamia, an area of approximately 100,000 square kilometers. The water volume required for an inundation of this extent and depth has no plausible source in Mesopotamian riverine hydrology. The Tigris and Euphrates in flood, even under extreme conditions, could not produce standing water of this depth across this geographical extent. The source of the water that deposited Wooley's layer was external to the Mesopotamian river system, and the cuneiform texts that describe this event with technical specificity provide an account of its source that the geological evidence does not contradict. The Sumerian flood narrative, preserved in its earliest written form on the CBS 10673 tablet from Nippur, and in its most detailed surviving version in the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, describes the inundation in terms that combine the vocabulary of meteorological catastrophe with references to phenomena that go beyond atmospheric events. The text describes the Anunnaki lifting their torches and setting the land ablaze before the flood began, a sequence that geological analysis of the Younger Dryas boundary layer has associated with impact-generated wildfires that preceded the flooding events of approximately 12,900 years ago. The Gilgamesh account's reference to the foundations of the earth being torn up alongside the opening of the heavens suggests that the inundation involved both atmospheric and geological disruption simultaneously, a combination consistent with the impact hypothesis for the Younger Dryas event, but inconsistent with any purely meteorological explanation. The cultural memory preserved in the Sumerian texts was apparently specific enough about the nature of this catastrophe to distinguish between its component causes, a level of observational detail that implies the memory derives from survivors with direct experience of the event, rather than from later mythological elaboration. The flood narrative preserved in the Sumerian tablets predating the better-known biblical account by at least 1,000 years contains technical specifications that have no place in religious mythology, but have every place in an eyewitness record preserved across generations through oral transmission. The dimensions of Utnapishtim's vessel, as described in the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the precise instructions for waterproofing with specific grades of bitumen, the sequenced loading procedure for biological specimens, and the use of navigational birds released at calculated intervals to determine proximity to land, all represent practical knowledge of naval architecture and maritime survival that would be superfluous in a text whose purpose was theological. What becomes undeniable when this Mesopotamian account is placed alongside flood traditions from the Hopi of the American Southwest, the Bundjalung people of Eastern Australia, the Maasai of East Africa, and more than 500 other documented cultures worldwide, is that the matching details extend to temporal specifics, construction materials, and behavioural indicators of the flood's onset that independent mythological invention simply does not produce. The vessel dimensions given in the Gilgamesh account specify a cubic structure of 60 metres on each side, a geometry that maximises internal volume relative to surface area and provides superior stability characteristics in open water conditions compared to elongated hull forms, a fact that modern naval architects confirm, but that Bronze Age shipbuilders had no theoretical framework to calculate independently. The waterproofing instructions specify the application of bitumen in 6 layers alternating with organic material, a composite sealing method that achieves flexible waterproofing superior to bitumen alone, particularly under conditions of hull flexion in rough water. The biological specimen loading procedure describes the sequenced embarkation of different species categories in an order that corresponds to the behavioral management requirements for keeping predators and prey animals in close proximity under stress, a practical knowledge that experience with captive animal management produces but that theological narrative does not require. The cross-cultural comparison of flood traditions conducted by Richard Andre in his 1891 study, subsequently expanded by Alan Dundas in the 1988 anthology, The Flood Myth, published by the University of California Press, identified over 500 independent flood traditions worldwide and documented the specific details that recur across accounts from cultures with no historical contact. The pattern that emerges from this comparison is not the vague similarity that would be expected from independently invented myths about water catastrophe, but a precise coincidence of technical and temporal details that implies common derivation from a shared historical event. The duration of the floodwaters at peak level, specified as 150 days in both the Mesopotamian and Hopi accounts, despite these cultures having no documented point of contact, is not a figure that independent mythological invention produces twice. The behavioral indicators preceding the flood onset, including disorientation among domestic animals and anomalous bird flight patterns, appear in identical form in Mesopotamian, Cherokee, Lakota, and Maasai traditions. The construction material for the survival vessel, specified as wood sealed with pitch or resin, appears across traditions from cultures whose geographical separation makes shared naval architecture knowledge implausible as an explanation. What 500 independent cultures preserved is not 500 independent myths about flooding. It is 500 transmissions of a single collective memory, encoded in the technical vocabulary of the cultures that received it, but pointing consistently toward a source event of the magnitude and specificity that the Younger Dryas geological record confirms actually occurred. The discovery and ongoing excavation of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, initially identified by Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute in 1994, introduced an anomaly into prehistoric studies so profound that its full implications are still being resisted by mainstream archaeology 2 decades later. The site, dating to approximately 9600 BC, predates the establishment of agriculture in the region, and predates the first Sumerian cities by more than 6,000 years. It consists of massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, some pillars standing over 5.5 meters in height, and weighing up to 20 tons, covered with precisely carved relief sculptures of animals and abstract symbols. The engineering required to quarry, transport, and erect these monoliths at this period of supposed human development exceeds any capability that conventional models of Neolithic culture can accommodate. But the feature of Göbekli Tepe that has generated the least discussion relative to its extraordinary significance is this. Around 8000 BC, the entire complex was deliberately and carefully buried, filled in with mixed soil and debris in a manner that suggests intentional preservation rather than abandonment, as if someone with foreknowledge of approaching catastrophe chose to hide evidence for future discovery. The physical evidence for deliberate burial at Göbekli Tepe is unambiguous in the excavation record and has been confirmed by every team that has worked the site since Schmidt's initial identification. The fill material that covers the structures to depths ranging from 3 to 9 meters across different enclosures is not natural accumulation. Natural site abandonment produces stratified deposits reflecting seasonal and climatic cycles, with layers of varying composition reflecting different depositional episodes. The Göbekli Tepe fill is mixed, combining topsoil, animal bones, flint tools, and stone fragments in a homogeneous matrix that indicates deliberate transport and deposition of material from the surrounding landscape rather than gradual accumulation in place. Lee Clare of the German Archaeological Institute, who led the post-Schmidt excavation program beginning in 2014, documented in the project's annual reports that the fill was deposited rapidly enough that the stratigraphic record shows no evidence of biological activity, plant growth, or erosion between the burial event and the overlying surface, indicating the burial was completed within a single episode rather than over an extended period. The carvings on the Göbekli Tepe pillars provide additional evidence that the complex was constructed and subsequently buried by individuals possessing knowledge that conventional models of pre-agricultural human capability cannot accommodate. The T-shaped pillars, whose cross-sectional form represents a stylized human figure, with the horizontal bar of the T indicating shoulders and a head, are decorated with relief carvings of animals executed with a technical precision that requires sustained tool pressure, three-dimensional spatial planning, and the ability to maintain consistent depth and form across curved stone surfaces. Schmidt documented over 60 distinct animal species represented in the carvings, executed with anatomical accuracy that implies detailed observational knowledge and artistic training of a type associated with settled, literate civilizations rather than nomadic hunter-gatherer bands. The abstract symbols accompanying the animal carvings include H-forms, crescent shapes, and geometric patterns that recur across multiple pillars and multiple enclosures in consistent combinations, indicating a standardized symbolic system of the type that written languages develop from, rather than the idiosyncratic markings that individual artistic expression produces. Archaeoastronomer Juan Antonio Belmonte of the Instituto de Astrofísica de Canarias and his colleague Andrew Collins conducted a comprehensive astronomical alignment analysis of the Göbekli Tepe enclosures published in the Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry journal in 2013. Their analysis established that the primary orientation axis of enclosure D, the largest and most elaborately decorated of the excavated structures, aligns with the rising point of the star Deneb in the constellation Cygnus at the horizon, as it appeared from this location around 9600 BC, accounting for precessional displacement. Deneb occupied a position near the north celestial pole during this epoch, making it a critical navigational reference star whose rising as zenith would have been of practical significance for a culture engaged in systematic astronomical observation. The alignment is not approximate. It falls within less than 1 degree of the calculated rising azimuth for Deneb at this date, a precision that requires deliberate design rather than coincidental orientation. The question of who possessed the organizational capability to quarry, transport, carve, erect, and ultimately bury the Göbekli Tepe complex at 9600 BC has no satisfactory answer within conventional prehistoric studies. The limestone pillars were quarried from bedrock outcrops on the plateau using techniques that required metal tools or equivalent cutting technology, yet the established metallurgical timeline places the first use of copper tools in this region approximately 5,000 years after Göbekli Tepe's construction. An unfinished pillar still attached to the bedrock at the quarry site and documented by Schmidt's team measures approximately 7 meters in length and weighs an estimated 50 tons. Providing direct evidence of the scale of quarrying operations and the cutting precision applied to raw stone before transport. The organizational capacity required to coordinate the labor of hundreds of workers across a multi-decade construction program at a remote, elevated site to maintain the technical standards evident in the finished structures and to ultimately execute a systematic burial program of the entire complex implies social and institutional structures that conventional models of pre-agricultural society do not include. The Göbekli Tepe evidence does not refine the conventional model. It invalidates it, and in doing so points toward the existence of organized, technically capable institutions operating in this region at a period that the Sumerian textual tradition specifically identifies as the era before civilization was formally established under divine direction. The territorial and administrative dimensions of that divine direction, as preserved in the cuneiform record, have received considerably less archaeological attention than the technological capabilities the same traditions describe. The cuneiform texts describing the territorial divisions maintained by the 3 primary Anunnaki figures, Anu, Enlil, and Enki, have been classified as mythological cosmogony since Mesopotamian studies established itself as an academic discipline in the 19th century. This classification has prevented scholars from asking what might be the more productive question. If these texts were read as administrative records rather than religious mythology, what would they describe? The answer, when the relevant tablets are examined with this interpretive frame, is a detailed account of planetary governance divided among 3 administrators with distinct spheres of authority, specific territorial boundaries, and documented disagreements about policy regarding the human populations under their management. The Babylonian text known as the Enumeration of Anu, preserved in fragments at the British Museum, describes Anu's domain as encompassing the northern regions of Mesopotamia into Anatolia, with particular concentration around elevated terrain, corresponding to modern Turkey and the Caucasus Mountains. The Kudurru boundary stones of the Kassite period, while dating to later centuries, preserve much older traditions that specify which mountain peaks remained forbidden to human settlement due to their continued occupation by beings whose nature the texts do not clarify, but whose presence they treat as current rather than historical. The territorial specificity of the Anunnaki administrative texts extends far beyond the vague geographical associations typical of ancient pantheons. Enlil's domain, described in the Sumerian hymn to Enlil preserved on tablets from the Ur III period and analysed by Thorkild Jacobsen in his 1976 study Treasures of Darkness, encompasses the central Mesopotamian plain with administrative concentration at Nippur, described throughout the cuneiform record as the command centre of the entire territorial system. The text provides specific details about Enlil's management functions within this territory, including oversight of agricultural water allocation, coordination of city administrative systems, and what the text describes as the issuing of binding decrees that governed conduct across all territories simultaneously. These are not the attributes of a weather deity personifying atmospheric phenomena. They are the operational profile of a territorial administrator exercising centralized authority over a geographically defined jurisdiction through institutional mechanisms rather than supernatural intervention. Enki's territorial assignment to the southern Mesopotamian marshlands and the Persian Gulf coastal region corresponds precisely with the archaeological distribution of the earliest and most technically sophisticated settlements in the region. The sites of Eridu, and the pre-Sumerian settlements along the ancient coastline that modern sea level change has placed underwater all fall within Enki's designated territory, as described in the administrative texts. The Sumerian text known as Enki and the World Order, preserved in its most complete form on a tablet in the University Museum at Philadelphia, designated CBS 1423, describes Enki's specific activities within this territory, in terms that include hydraulic management, as mineral extraction coordination, and what the text calls the fixing of the destinies of cities, a phrase that in Sumerian administrative language refers to the establishment of institutional charters rather than supernatural fate assignment. Each of these administrative activities corresponds to physical evidence recoverable from archaeological sites within the described territory, a correspondence that mythological invention does not systematically produce. The boundary disputes documented between Enlil and Enki across multiple independent cuneiform sources add a dimension of institutional specificity that mythological tradition rarely preserves. The text known as the Myth of the Pickaxe describes a disagreement between the 2 administrators about the appropriate technology for agricultural development, with Enlil advocating for one approach and Enki proposing an alternative whose technical details the text preserves in vocabulary drawn from actual agricultural practice. The resolution of this dispute through consultation with the Divine Council, rather than through supernatural decree, mirrors the administrative dispute resolution processes documented in Sumerian legal texts, and its preservation across multiple independent versions across several centuries suggests it records an actual institutional disagreement rather than symbolic narrative. The mathematical knowledge that Enki's administrative tradition specifically attributed as foundational to all of these territorial management activities has left its most explicit physical trace in a document whose implications for the history of mathematics have been systematically underestimated since its acquisition by Columbia University in the 1930s. Among the artifacts housed in the rare book and manuscript library at Columbia University, a small clay tablet designated Plimpton 322 occupies a position of peculiar significance in the history of mathematics. The tablet, dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BC, contains a table of numbers organized in 4 columns that, when analyzed by mathematician Otto Neugebauer in 1945, proved to be a sophisticated trigonometric table encoding Pythagorean triples with a computational method that would not be formally described in mathematical literature until the work of Greek geometers more than 1,000 years later. The conventional explanation for this achievement, that Babylonian mathematicians independently developed advanced trigonometric concepts before the Greeks, raises a question that the conventional explanation does not answer. Where is the developmental record? Mathematical traditions leave traces of their progressive development in the archaeological record, simpler problems solved before complex ones, elementary methods preceding sophisticated techniques. The Plimpton tablet and the broader corpus of Old Babylonian mathematics arrive in the record already displaying the hallmarks of a mature advanced system, suggesting transmission from earlier sources rather than indigenous development. The specific content of the Plimpton 322 tablet, analysed in detail by Daniel Mansfield of the University of New South Wales and Norman Wildberger in their 2017 study published in Historia Mathematica, reveals computational capabilities that place it beyond any plausible Old Babylonian developmental context. The tablet's 4 columns encode 15 rows of numbers representing the ratios of sides in right triangles, with angles ranging systematically from approximately 45 degrees to approximately 31 degrees in decrements of approximately 1 degree per row. The computational method used to generate these numbers, which Mansfield and Wildberger identified as a ratio-based approach to trigonometric calculation that differs fundamentally from the Greek chord table method and is in some respects computationally superior to it, implies not only knowledge of the mathematical relationships involved, but the existence of a systematic program for generating and tabulating them. This is not a mathematical discovery. It is a mathematical tool produced by a tradition with established methods for systematic trigonometric calculation, and its appearance in the Old Babylonian record without developmental precursor requires explanation that the conventional attribution of indigenous Babylonian genius does not provide. The broader Old Babylonian mathematical corpus, comprising over 900 tablets analysed in the comprehensive survey conducted by Eleanor Robson of University College London and published as Mathematics in Ancient Iraq in 2008, demonstrates consistent characteristics of a transmitted rather than indigenously developed knowledge system. The mathematical methods represented across these tablets employ computational approaches whose theoretical basis is never explained or derived within the texts themselves, suggesting that the text record applications of mathematical principles whose theoretical foundations were understood elsewhere and transmitted to Babylonian scribal schools as established procedures rather than as knowledge requiring independent derivation. The sexagesimal number system underlying all of these calculations, based on 60 rather than the 10 or 20 that most human cultures independently develop as numerical bases, has no developmental origin story in the Mesopotamian record. It appears fully formed as the operating system of Sumerian mathematics from the earliest written records, as if it arrived with the civilization rather than developing alongside it, which is precisely what the cuneiform tradition's own account of mathematical origin states. The institution credited in the cuneiform record with establishing the foundational principles from which all of Mesopotamian mathematical achievement derived is the same institution whose origins the Eridu Genesis describes with the administrative precision that has characterized the textual evidence throughout this investigation. That text, the oldest written account of civilization's beginning, preserves a memory of institutional establishment whose specific details deserve examination in their own right, independent of the theological framework that later tradition imposed upon them. The text known as the Eridu Genesis, preserved on a single tablet from the University of Pennsylvania's Nippur collection, designated CBS 10673, represents the oldest known written account of human origins and the Great Flood. Composed in Sumerian around 2100 BC but transparently preserving oral traditions of much greater antiquity, the text describes a period before cities existed, before kingship had descended from heaven, when the land had not yet been given a name and the gods had not yet been assigned their duties. What distinguishes this account from the mythological origin stories of later cultures is the administrative precision with which it records the transition from this primordial state to organized civilization. The text does not describe gods creating the world through symbolic or supernatural acts. It describes a decision made by a council of divine beings to establish cities, to assign each city its protective deity, and to introduce the institution of kingship as an administrative mechanism for managing the human population. The language employed throughout belongs to the vocabulary of Sumerian bureaucracy, not religious poetry, a distinction that carries significant interpretive weight. Thorkild Jacobsen, whose 1943 translation of the Eridu Genesis in the Journal of the American Oriental Society remains the standard scholarly reference for this text, noted the administrative character of its language while attributing it to the Sumerian cultural tendency to conceptualize divine activities in bureaucratic terms. This attribution, while internally consistent within Jacobsen's interpretive framework, does not account for the specificity of the institutional details the text preserves. The Eridu Genesis does not merely describe the general establishment of cities, it names the 5 cities established before the flood, identifies the specific deity assigned to administer each, and records the sequence in which they were founded. The cities named Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak correspond to actual archaeological sites, all of which have produced physical evidence of occupation in the pre-flood stratum, all of which are located within the territorial boundaries that the Anunnaki administrative texts assign to the divine administrators named as their overseers, and all of which appear in the independent Sumerian king list as antediluvian royal centres. This triple correspondence between the Eridu Genesis city list, the Anunnaki territorial texts, and the king list sequence, across documents composed at different periods for different purposes, is the fingerprint of historical record rather than the coincidence of independent mythological invention. The phrase used in the Eridu Genesis to describe the establishment of kingship, "Namen lila ki anta banamtum," translates precisely as kingship was lowered from heaven, a phrase whose spatial and directional specificity has no metaphorical necessity, but has obvious literal significance if the beings implementing this institutional arrangement arrive from a location outside the immediate geographical context. The administrative procedures described for the assignment of cities to divine overseers employ the Sumerian term nam-tar, meaning the fixing of destiny or the issuance of an institutional charter, a term used throughout Sumerian legal and administrative texts for the formal establishment of governance structures. The Eridu Genesis is using the vocabulary of institutional foundation documents to describe events that conventional scholarship treats as mythology, a category error whose consequences for the accurate understanding of Mesopotamian history have been significant and sustained. Those consequences become most tangible when the text's account of what existed before the cities is placed alongside physical evidence of a technical tradition whose capabilities exceeded anything the post-flood archaeological record recovers, a tradition whose physical remains have been accumulating at sites around the world in ways that institutional archaeology has struggled to accommodate, at an altitude of nearly 4,000 metres on the Bolivian Altiplano. The ruins of Pumapunku present physical evidence of stoneworking precision that has no satisfactory explanation within the technological parameters assigned to the cultures believed to have constructed it. The site, associated with the broader Tiwanaku complex and variously dated between 500 and 800 AD by mainstream archaeology, contains andite blocks weighing up to 130 tons, whose cut surfaces achieve tolerances measured in fractions of a millimetre across spans of several metres. These are not rough approximations of geometric forms, they are precise mechanical components featuring H-shaped clamps, dovetail connections, and interlocking tongue and groove assemblies that demonstrate engineering knowledge of structural load distribution and seismic resistance that the cultures credited with their production did not otherwise demonstrate. The nearest andite quarry lies approximately 90 kilometres from the site, across terrain that includes the full elevation of the Altiplano Plateau, and the methods by which stones of this weight were transported across this distance, using the technology available to pre-Columbian Andean cultures, have never been convincingly demonstrated. The H-shaped clamps documented at Pumapunku by archaeologist Jean-Pierre Protzen of the University of California, Berkeley, and subsequently analysed by engineer Matthew Lacroix in a structural mechanics study conducted in 2011, deserve particular attention for what they reveal about the knowledge base of the site's builders. These clamps cut directly into the upper surfaces of adjacent blocks to receive cast metal fasteners that lock the stones together across their joints, required the simultaneous solution of 3 independent engineering problems: the precise positioning of the clamp recesses relative to the block joint geometry, the selection of a metal alloy with appropriate thermal contraction properties, to create a tight fit upon cooling after casting, and the calculation of the clamp dimensions required to distribute the structural load across the joint without stress concentration at the recess corners. Metallurgical analysis of recovered clamp material, conducted by archaeometallurgist Heather Lechtman of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, identified the metal as a bronze alloy of copper and arsenic in proportions that optimize both castability and structural strength for this application, proportions that modern materials science confirms as near optimal for the intended function, but that empirical trial and error metallurgy does not converge upon without theoretical guidance. The surface finish achieved on the Pumapunku blocks provides independent confirmation of cutting capabilities that exceed any tool technology available to pre-Columbian Andean cultures. Protson's precision measurements of flat surfaces across multiple blocks documented surface planarity deviations of less than 0.5 mm across spans exceeding 2 meters, a flatness tolerance that modern stone fabrication achieves using diamond-tipped cutting equipment and precision measurement instruments. The edges of these surfaces meet at right angles accurate to within fractions of a degree, maintained consistently across cuts of varying depth and orientation. The drill holes documented throughout the site, analysed by engineer Christopher Dunn in his 2004 study of ancient precision manufacturing, display diameter consistency and wall parallelism, characteristics that imply rotational cutting with a tool maintaining constant geometry under sustained pressure, characteristics inconsistent with handheld stone or bone-boring tools, but consistent with mechanically driven tubular drill bits of a type that the conventional Andean tool inventory does not include. The organisational and logistical scale of the Pumapunku construction programme adds dimensions to the precision engineering puzzle that purely technological analysis does not capture, transporting 130-ton blocks across 90 kilometres of high-altitude terrain at elevations. Exceeding 4,000 metres above sea level requires not only the physical means of moving such masses, but a transportation infrastructure of roads, bridges, and loading facilities capable of supporting them, an administrative organisation capable of coordinating the labour of thousands of workers across multi-year transport operations, and a supply chain capable of maintaining a workforce at altitude throughout the construction period. No physical evidence of such infrastructure exists between the Pumapunku site and the andesite quarry sources, and the Tiwanaku culture credited with the construction left no administrative record of the organisational systems that would have been required to accomplish it. What it left instead are the finished blocks themselves, whose precision is not a mystery that better understanding of ancient Andean culture will eventually resolve, but a fact about physical reality that demands an explanation commensurate with its specificity. The first book of Enoch, preserved most completely in the Ethiopic manuscript tradition, and partially confirmed by Aramaic fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, dating to the 2nd century BC, has been treated by religious scholarship primarily as a theological text, and by secular scholarship primarily as an embarrassment. Its detailed account of 200 divine beings who descended to Mount Hermon, took human partners, transmitted forbidden knowledge across multiple technical domains, and were subsequently punished by imprisonment in subterranean locations, reads uncomfortably like a historical chronicle dressed in the vocabulary of Jewish angelology. The Aramaic fragments designated in the Dead Sea Scrolls catalogue as 4 Q201 through 4 Q208 preserve the oldest recoverable version of this narrative, and their linguistic analysis, conducted by Joseph Millick for the Oxford University Press edition of 1976, established that the terminology employed for the descending beings, the specific knowledge domains attributed to each, and the geographical setting of their activities, all derive directly from Mesopotamian textual traditions that predate the composition of Enoch by centuries. The parallel between the Enochic Watchers and the Mesopotamian Apkallu extends beyond general thematic similarity to specific technical correspondences that independent mythological development does not produce. Millick's linguistic analysis identified 17 distinct Aramaic terms used in the Enoch fragments for the activities and attributes of the descending beings whose direct equivalents appear in Akkadian cuneiform texts from the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods. The Aramaic term used for the Watcher's act of descent, Nephilah, derives from a root whose technical meaning in the context of the Dead Sea Scroll fragments corresponds precisely to the Akkadian term used in the Apkallu texts for the approach of divine beings from their celestial domain to the terrestrial realm. This is not a borrowing of general religious vocabulary. It is the preservation of specific technical terminology applied to a specific category of event, transmitted from Mesopotamian scribal tradition into the Aramaic cultural context of Second Temple Judaism through channels that the historical record of the Babylonian exile makes entirely plausible. The knowledge domains attributed to individual watcher leaders in the Enoch fragments correspond with striking specificity to the domains assigned to individual Apkallu in the Mesopotamian tradition. Azazel, the watcher identified in the Enoch text as the primary transmitter of metallurgical knowledge, is credited with teaching the working of metals, including the production of swords, daggers, and shields, alongside the preparation of antimony and other mineral compounds for cosmetic and chemical applications. The Mesopotamian Apkallu Nungal Pirigaldim is credited in the cuneiform tradition with the introduction of bronze working and the knowledge of mineral preparation, a domain correspondence whose specificity extends to the pairing of weapons, manufacture with mineral chemistry that appears in both traditions as a single interconnected knowledge area. This pairing reflects an actual relationship within ancient metallurgy, where the same mineral processing knowledge that produces refined metals for weapons also produces the mineral compounds used for surface treatments and preservation. But it is not a pairing that independent mythological invention would consistently reproduce across culturally separated traditions. The geographical setting of the Enoch narrative, Mount Hermon, on the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, receives treatment in the text that goes beyond simple narrative location to include specific topographical and geological details that have been confirmed by modern survey. The text describes Mount Hermon as a place where certain mountain peaks were set apart and dedicated to specific functions, with some peaks maintained as permanent installations accessible only to the watcher beings and their designated human intermediaries. Archaeological surveys conducted by the Israel Antiquities Authority between 1998 and 2007 documented over 100 stone enclosures and megalithic structures on the summit plateau and upper slopes of Mount Hermon, some incorporating construction techniques, including precisely fitted large limestone blocks and astronomically aligned entrance passages that are inconsistent with known historical or prehistoric cultures of the region. The summit temple complex at an elevation of approximately 2,800 meters shows foundation courses of limestone blocks whose fitting precision matches the characteristics documented at Mesopotamian sites associated with divine administrative installations, establishing a physical connection between the Enochic geographical setting and the broader pattern of anomalous ancient construction that this investigation has been tracing across multiple continents. The punishment narrative in the Enoch text, which describes the watcher beings as bound in the valleys of the earth and condemned to witness specific consequences of their unauthorized activities before facing a more final judgment, corresponds to traditions in the Mesopotamian record describing the confinement of certain Apkallu following their violation of protocols governing human interaction. The Neo-Babylonian text known as the Bit Maseri, analysed by Assyriologist Erica Reiner in her 1958 study published by the Pontifical Biblical Institute, describes a category of beings called Tukulemnutu, whose original status as knowledge-transmitting divine intermediaries was altered by a judgment that restricted their activities and confined their operational range to specific geographical locations. The correspondence between this Mesopotamian tradition and the Enoch punishment narrative is detailed enough to constitute evidence of direct transmission rather than parallel mythological development. And it points toward a common historical tradition underlying both accounts, whose origins predate both the Enochic and Mesopotamian texts by an indeterminate but potentially very considerable period. The physical evidence of that tradition's geographical reach extends far beyond the ancient Near East into cartographic records whose accuracy implies a comprehensive knowledge of the Earth's surface that conventional history cannot explain. On the 18th of October, 1513, Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis completed a world map that has remained one of cartography's most consequential anomalies for 5 centuries. The map, compiled from source materials that Piri Reis himself identified as including charts used by Christopher Columbus and documents dating to the time of Alexander the Great, depicts the coastlines of South America and the Antarctic continent with an accuracy that European cartography would not achieve for the Atlantic coast of South America until the 18th century, and has not achieved for the Antarctic subglacial coastline even today. The Antarctic portion of the map depicts the continent's landmass as it appears beneath its ice sheet, a configuration that has been confirmed by 20th century seismic surveys but was unknown to any mapping tradition before the age of modern geophysical investigation. The map shows Antarctica connected to South America by a land bridge configuration that geological evidence places approximately 6,000 years before the map's compilation date. The implications of this accuracy for any cartographic source that Piri Reis might plausibly have accessed have never been satisfactorily explained by mainstream historical geography. The most rigorous analysis of the Piri Reis map's accuracy was conducted by Charles Hapgood of Keene State College, whose 1966 study Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings examined the map's projections, coordinate systems and geographical content against known cartographic traditions and modern geographical data. Hapgood's analysis, which drew on technical consultation from cartographers at the United States Air Force Reconnaissance Technical Squadron at Westover Air Force Base, established that the South American coastline on the map was plotted with a longitude accuracy that exceeded anything achievable with the navigational instruments available to 15th and 16th century European explorers. The correct placement of the mouth of the Amazon River, the accurate depiction of the Falkland Islands at their correct latitude, and the consistent eastward displacement of the entire South American coast at a magnitude corresponding to the magnetic declination applicable to the longitude of the original survey all indicate that the source charts for this portion of the map were compiled by navigators using instruments capable of accurate longitude determination. The marine chronometer that made accurate longitude measurement possible was not developed until John Harrison's work in the mid-18th century, placing the original survey of South America's Atlantic coast at a minimum 2 centuries after Piri Reis compiled his map, and the instruments required for the survey precision documented in the map's South American section at a minimum 5 centuries after the map's compilation date. The Antarctic section of the Piri Reis map presents an even more challenging problem for conventional historical geography. The United States Navy Hydrographic Office conducted a formal analysis of the map's Antarctic depictions in 1960, and the resulting assessment, preserved in correspondence between Hydrographic Office Captain Lorenzo Burrows and Hapgood, confirmed that the map shows the coastline of Antarctica as it appears beneath the continental ice sheet, including coastal mountain ranges and embayments that were confirmed by the seismic profiling conducted during the International Geophysical Year of 1957 and 1958. The ice sheet covering Antarctica has been in place for at minimum 6,000 years, according to core drilling data analysed by glaciologist John Mercer in his 1978 study published in Nature, meaning the original survey of the Antarctic coastline that provided the source data for this section of the Piri Reis map was conducted at a minimum 6,000 years before the map's compilation. During a period when conventional historical models place human civilization at the level of Neolithic agricultural communities, the existence of accurate circumnavigation of the Antarctic coastline at this date implies maritime technology, navigational instrumentation, and global organizational capability of a type that the conventional developmental timeline of human civilization does not permit. The Orontius Phineus map of 1531 and the Mercator map of 1569 both depict Antarctica with geographical features that have been confirmed by 20th century geological survey, including the division of the continent into eastern and western sections by the Transantarctic Mountains, and the identification of what appear to be river systems in coastal regions that would have been ice-free during the period when the original source surveys were conducted. Hapgood's analysis of these maps collectively identified a tradition of Antarctic cartography that preserved source data of extraordinary accuracy through medieval intermediaries, without the medieval copyists apparently understanding what they were reproducing, a transmission pattern entirely consistent with the preservation of ancient knowledge through scribal traditions whose practitioners maintained the forms of the knowledge they copied without retaining access to the capabilities that originally produced it. The mathematical knowledge that made such comprehensive global surveying possible was itself being preserved through exactly this kind of formal transmission in institutions whose physical remains the archaeological record is increasingly able to identify. Among the artifacts recovered from excavations at Kujut Rabu near Baghdad by Wilhelm König of the Iraq Museum in 1936, a group of ceramic vessels attracted attention that their original excavators were initially reluctant to publish. The objects, dating to the Parthian period between 250 BC and 250 AD, consist of clay jars approximately 14 centimeters in height, containing copper cylinders soldered closed at one end with a tin-lead alloy, with iron rods suspended within the copper tubes and insulated from direct contact by a layer of asphalt. When König recognized these components as constituting a complete galvanic cell requiring only an electrolyte solution to function as an electrical battery, he submitted his findings to mainstream academic review and encountered the institutional resistance that has characterized scholarly responses to anomalous ancient technology ever since. Subsequent testing conducted by Willard Gray at the General Electric High Voltage Laboratory demonstrated that vessels of this design produce electrical currents of approximately 1.1 volts when filled with grape juice or vinegar, precisely the type of acidic solution available in ancient Mesopotamia. The design precision of the Baghdad battery jars extends beyond the functional sufficiency that accidental discovery would produce to the systematic optimization that deliberate engineering achieves. The copper cylinders fit within the ceramic vessels with clearances of approximately 2 mm on each side, a dimensional relationship that maximizes electrolyte volume while maintaining electrical insulation between the electrode assemblies and the vessel walls. The asphalt insulation layer between the copper cylinder and the iron rod is applied with uniform thickness across the full height of the assembly, a manufacturing consistency that implies a standardized production process rather than individual crafting. Most significantly, the tin-lead solder used to close the copper cylinder ends has a composition of approximately 60% tin and 40% lead, a ratio that produces a lower melting point than either pure metal while maintaining adequate mechanical strength, a composition that modern electronics manufacturing specifies as eutectic solder for its optimal properties in exactly this type of application. The selection of this specific alloy ratio by Parthian craftsmen of 2,000 years ago implies either theoretical knowledge of metallurgical phase diagrams or extensive empirical optimization of solder composition, either of which represents a level of electrochemical sophistication that the conventional account of ancient Mesopotamian technology does not include. The discovery context of the Baghdad batteries places them within a broader pattern of electrochemical knowledge in the ancient Near East that König's initial find only partially revealed. Arne Eggebrecht of the Roma Peliseus Museum in Hildesheim conducted electroplating experiments in the 1970s using replicas of the Baghdad battery design and demonstrated that the devices produce sufficient current to deposit thin gold films on silver surfaces through conventional electroplating. Procedures. His examination of Parthian and pre-Parthian metal artifacts in museum collections subsequently identified objects with surface characteristics consistent with electrochemical deposition, including uniform coating thickness and adhesion properties that exceed what mechanical gilding techniques achieve. The distribution of similar galvanic cell designs across archaeological sites in Egypt and the broader ancient Near East, documented in König's follow-up survey published posthumously in 1951, suggests that electrochemical technology was not an isolated Parthian development, but represented a regional technical tradition with considerably deeper roots. A tradition whose theoretical foundations required understanding of electrochemical principles that were not formally described in scientific literature until Alessandro Volta's work in 1800. The technological gap between this ancient practical application and its modern theoretical understanding mirrors the pattern documented across every domain of anomalous ancient capability that this investigation has examined, and it repeats with particular force at a site whose implications for the timeline of human civilization extend far deeper than the 2,000-year antiquity of the Baghdad batteries themselves. In December of 2001, the National Institute of Ocean Technology of India completed a marine archaeological survey off the coast of Gujarat in the Gulf of Kambat that produced findings so inconsistent with accepted timelines of South Asian urban development that the institution's own press release was treated with skepticism by the international academic community. At depths ranging from 20 to 40 meters, marine sonar mapping revealed geometric stone structures extending across an area of several square kilometers, including what appeared to be massive walls, organized street grids, and rectangular building foundations arranged with the kind of deliberate planning that characterizes urban centers rather than natural geological formations. Carbon dating of organic material recovered from the site by dredging produced dates of approximately 9,000 years ago, placing the construction of these structures at a period when South Asian civilization, according to conventional archaeological consensus, consisted of small agricultural villages with no capacity for urban planning of this scale. The location corresponds precisely with the ancient city of Dwarka described in the Mahabharata as the capital of Krishna, submerged beneath the sea when its divine patron departed the earth. The sonar imaging data collected by the National Institute of Ocean Technology Survey, analysed by marine archaeologist S.R. Rao of the National Institute of Oceanography, who had previously conducted underwater surveys of the historically documented medieval Dwarka, revealed structural features whose geometric regularity excluded natural formation processes. The sonar returns showed wall alignments maintaining consistent bearing over distances exceeding 100 meters, right-angle intersections at intervals consistent with block planning, and foundation outlines of rectangular structures with internal subdivisions corresponding to multi-room building layouts. The depth of these features, between 20 and 40 meters below current sea level, corresponds precisely to the sea level of the Gulf of Kambat approximately 9,000 years ago, according to the sea level reconstruction, published by quaternary scientist Encarni Montoya of the University of Granada in 2014. Confirming that the structures were built at a period when this area was dry land and were subsequently submerged by the sea level rise that followed the end of the last ice age. The Mahabharata's description of Dwarka's submersion, preserved across multiple manuscript traditions and analysed by Indologist Alf Hilterbytel of George Washington University in his 2001 study of the epic's historical content, describes the city's disappearance beneath the sea as occurring immediately following the departure of Krishna from the earthly realm, an event that the text places within a specific astronomical context corresponding to the transition between cosmic ages. The precision of the Mahabharata's account of the city's physical dimensions, including walls of specific height and thickness, harbour facilities of described capacity, and urban districts organised according to named functional categories, corresponds to the scale and organisational complexity suggested by the sonar mapping data from the Gulf of Kambat survey. Establishing a correspondence between textual tradition and physical evidence of the type that the Sumerian king list shares with the Mesopotamian flood deposits documented by Woolley. What this convergence of text and physical evidence at Dwarka reveals is not merely another data point in the case for advanced prehistoric civilization, but a specific instance of the pattern that the cuneiform record describes as universal: the submersion of antediluvian cities under rising seas following the catastrophe, whose geological signature the Younger Dryas boundary layer preserves across multiple continents. In 1901, Greek sponge divers working a Roman shipwreck site near the island of Antikythera, at a depth of approximately 45 meters, brought to the surface a corroded lump of bronze that sat unexamined in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens for 2 years before archaeologist Valerios Stais noticed gear teeth protruding from its corroded surface. The subsequent century of analysis, culminating in the CT scanning program conducted by the Antikythera Mechanism research project between 2005 and 2016, revealed the object to be a mechanical analog computer of extraordinary sophistication, containing at minimum 37 interlocking bronze gears capable of calculating the positions of the Sun and Moon in the zodiac. Predicting lunar and solar eclipses according to the Saros cycle, encoded in a gear with 223 teeth, and tracking the 4-year cycle of the Pan-Hellenic Games. The differential gearing employed in the mechanism's construction is a mechanical principle not officially described in engineering literature until the 16th century, creating a technological gap of over 1,400 years between this device and its supposed reinvention. The inscription found on the mechanism's fragments, analysed by Alexander Jones of New York University, references astronomical phenomena and calendar systems that place its design tradition in a Babylonian astronomical heritage extending back centuries before the device's construction. The CT scanning analysis conducted by the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project under the direction of Tony Freeth of University College London produced imaging data that revealed the mechanism's internal structure in sufficient detail to identify gear tooth counts, shaft arrangements, and mechanical linkages that previous external examination had been unable to document. The results, published in the journal Nature in 2006 and in a comprehensive technical report in 2016, established that the mechanism incorporated a differential gear assembly connecting the lunar and solar calculation systems in a manner that automatically computes the difference between solar and lunar positions without manual input. A mechanical solution to a specific computational problem whose elegance implies not a first attempt at mechanical computation, but the culmination of a development tradition that had already solved simpler problems and was applying established mechanical principles to increasingly complex astronomical calculations. The Babylonian astronomical heritage identified in the mechanism's inscriptions by Jones provides the crucial link between the device's computational capabilities and the pre-existing knowledge tradition that made its design possible. The Saros eclipse prediction cycle encoded in the mechanism's 223-tooth gear is a Babylonian discovery documented in cuneiform astronomical texts from the first millennium BC, and the specific mathematical refinements applied to the basic Saros cycle in the mechanism's eclipse prediction system correspond to improvements on the raw Saros period that Babylonian astronomers had developed through the accumulation of observational data across the astronomical diary series. The mechanism is not a Greek invention that independently reproduced Babylonian astronomical knowledge. It is a Greek mechanical implementation of a Babylonian computational tradition whose ultimate origins, as the cuneiform record consistently maintains, predate the Babylonian civilization that transmitted it to the Hellenistic world. The device recovered from the Antikythera shipwreck is therefore not an anomaly in the history of technology, but a moment of visibility in a continuous tradition of sophisticated knowledge that has been flowing through human civilization since a period far earlier than conventional history acknowledges, a tradition whose institutional channels and preservation mechanisms the final segments of this investigation are now positioned to examine. The Babylonian mystery schools that operated within the temple complexes of Marduk at Babylon and Nabu at Borsippa during the Neo-Babylonian and Seleucid periods have been studied primarily as religious institutions, their preservation functions understood in theological terms rather than technological ones. The administrative tablets that document these institutions, however, reveal educational programs of a specificity and technical depth that exceed any plausible religious requirement. Cuneiform records from the Seleucid period describe curriculum requirements that included advanced mathematical training in base 60 computational methods, astronomical calculation techniques for predicting planetary positions across multi-year cycles, metallurgical instruction in alloy composition and smelting procedures, and what the texts describe as the ancient procedures for maintaining the divine instruments. A category of technical knowledge whose practical content the administrative language leaves suggestively vague. The training period described in these records extended for decades, suggesting that the knowledge being transmitted was of sufficient complexity and volume to require generational transmission rather than individual mastery, a characteristic consistent with the preservation of a comprehensive technological heritage rather than the transmission of ritual practice. The administrative structure of the Babylonian mystery schools, documented in temple archive tablets from Babylon, analysed by Assyriologist Amelie Kurt of University College London in her 1995 study The Ancient Near East, reveals an institutional organisation whose characteristics distinguish it sharply from the religious education programs typical of ancient temple complexes. The schools maintained separate administrative hierarchies from the temple's religious personnel, with their own records of enrolment, progression through curriculum levels, and financial accounts for the procurement of specialised materials that included imported minerals, rare metals, and optical components described in purchasing records as lenses for the great instruments. The procurement records specify quantities and grades of materials that exceed any plausible liturgical requirement, including multiple references to crystalline quartz of specified transparency standards and bronze alloys of specified composition ratios that correspond to the material requirements for precision optical and mechanical instruments rather than ceremonial objects. The curriculum progression documented in these administrative records extended through a minimum of 4 distinct levels, each requiring demonstrated competency in the preceding level's content before advancement was permitted. The first level covered mathematical fundamentals including base 60 arithmetic, geometric calculation methods, and the astronomical observation procedures for identifying and recording stellar positions with specified accuracy tolerances. The second level introduced planetary motion calculation, eclipse prediction using the Saros and Metonic cycles, and what the records describe as the reading of the ancient tablets, a curriculum element whose specific content is not elaborated in the administrative records but whose designation implies engagement with source materials of pre-Babylonian origin. The third and fourth levels, accessible only to students who had demonstrated exceptional capability in earlier levels, and who had undergone what the records describe as the examination of fitness, involved instruction in the ancient procedures content whose precise nature the administrative language systematically obscures through the use of technical terminology that does not appear in any other category of Babylonian text. The examination of fitness described in Seleucid period enrollment records involved assessments that went beyond intellectual capability testing to include physical and genealogical evaluation. Berossus, the Babylonian priest who compiled his history of Mesopotamia in Greek around 280 BC while serving within the institutional tradition that these mystery schools represented, describes in fragments preserved by Josephus and Eusebius the requirement that candidates for the highest levels of instruction demonstrate what he terms the ancient lineage, a genealogical qualification whose specific content the surviving fragments do not elaborate, but whose existence confirms that access to the most sensitive preserved knowledge was restricted not only by demonstrated capability, but by hereditary qualification. This combination of intellectual and genealogical selection criteria mirrors the bloodline preservation protocols described in the cuneiform administrative texts from the final period of direct Anunnaki presence in Mesopotamia, suggesting that the mystery schools were not merely preserving knowledge but maintaining the specific human lineages that the original knowledge transmission program had identified as its institutional carriers. The physical infrastructure of the Borsippa temple complex where the Nabu Mystery School operated provides archaeological confirmation of educational and research activities that exceeded normal temple functions. Excavations conducted by a German Archaeological Institute team under the direction of Joachim Marzahn between 1980 and 1990 uncovered laboratory facilities beneath the temple's secondary precincts that contained equipment for chemical analysis, metallurgical experimentation, and astronomical instrument calibration. The laboratory chambers were equipped with furnaces of a construction type not found in standard Babylonian metal workshops, incorporating temperature regulation features that allowed controlled heating to specified maximum temperatures, a capability required for the precise alloy production that the Mystery School procurement records document, but not for the general metal working that conventional ancient metallurgy practiced. The survival of these laboratory facilities in identifiable condition after more than 2 millennia of burial confirms that the mystery schools were engaged in ongoing technical research rather than merely transmitting received knowledge, a distinction that carries significant implications for understanding how advanced ancient capabilities were maintained across the centuries between their original establishment and their eventual influence on the Hellenistic intellectual tradition that succeeded Babylonian civilization. The knowledge that these institutions preserved with such institutional care extended as the mathematical evidence embedded in ancient astronomical systems demonstrates. To a comprehensive understanding of cosmic cycles, whose accurate calculation required observational and computational resources that the mystery schools maintained specifically to preserve. The precession of the equinoxes, the approximately 25,920-year cycle resulting from the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis, is conventionally attributed as a discovery to the Greek astronomer Hipparchus, who documented it around 127 BC. The attribution has been under sustained challenge for decades by researchers who have found clear evidence of precessional knowledge embedded in astronomical and architectural traditions that predate Hipparchus by thousands of years. The Sumerian numerical system, based on multiples of 60, contains embedded calculations whose significance becomes apparent only when examined against precessional mathematics. The Sumerian sacred number 432,000 represents exactly 100 precessional cycles of the equinoctial point through 1 degree of arc. The Hindu Kali Yuga of 432,000 years, the antediluvian reign total of the Sumerian king list at 241,200 years, and multiple other numerological constants distributed across ancient astronomical traditions worldwide share the same mathematical relationship to the precessional cycle. Suggesting not independent coincidence but coordinated encoding of astronomical knowledge in cultural traditions designed to preserve it across the civilizational disruptions that the same traditions predicted would occur. The mathematical relationship between the Sumerian base 60 number system and precessional mechanics is not a pattern that emerges only in the most prominent sacred numbers. It pervades the entire structure of Sumerian quantitative measurement in a way that implies the number system was designed with precessional calculation as a primary application, rather than having precessional relationships noticed as an interesting property of an independently developed counting system. 60 divides evenly into 360, the number of degrees in a circle and the approximate number of days in a solar year, both quantities fundamental to astronomical calculation. 360 multiplied by 72, the number of years required for the precessional point to advance 1 degree through the zodiac, yields 25,920, the full precessional cycle. 72 multiplied by 60 yields 4,320, 10 times the Kali Yuga period, and the number that appears in the Sumerian Sar count for significant chronological periods. These relationships are not coincidences of a number system that happen to be base 60. They are the mathematical skeleton of a system specifically constructed to make precessional calculations computationally tractable, and their presence in the foundational structure of Sumerian mathematics from the earliest written records implies that precessional knowledge was not a late discovery of Sumerian astronomers, but a foundational input into the knowledge system that the civilization inherited at its inception. Giorgio de Santillana of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Hertha von der Hend of the University of Frankfurt documented the global distribution of precessional knowledge in their 1969 study Hamlet's Mill, which traced the mathematical constants of precession through mythological traditions from Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, Iceland, West Africa, and the pre-Columbian Americas. Their analysis established that the number 72, its multiples, and the related figures of 36, 108, and 432 appear in cosmological contexts across cultures with no historical contact, always in relationships that encode precessional mathematics. The precision of these relationships across such a wide cultural distribution argues for a common source of precessional knowledge that predates the divergence of these cultural traditions from their common prehistoric origin. Placing the original calculation of the precessional cycle at a date far earlier than any civilizational context that conventional archaeology identifies as capable of the sustained astronomical observation required to detect and measure it. The Great Pyramid of Giza provides perhaps the most precisely documented architectural encoding of precessional knowledge in the physical record. Robert Bauval's analysis of the pyramid's internal shaft alignments, published in his 1994 study The Orion Mystery co-authored with Adrian Gilbert, demonstrated that the southern shaft of the King's Chamber was directed toward the belt stars of Orion as they appeared from Giza at their lowest culmination point in the precessional cycle, a position that occurred around 10,500 BC. The precision of this alignment, confirmed by independent astronomical calculation by astronomer Ed Krupp of the Griffith Observatory, and subsequently by computational modelling conducted by Kate Spence of Cambridge University, requires knowledge not only of the star's current position, but of their precessional displacement across thousands of years from the date of the pyramid's conventional construction, implying that the pyramid's architects either possessed comprehensive precessional data extending thousands of years into the past, or were working from plans whose design predated the structure's physical construction by a comparable interval. Either explanation places the source of the architectural knowledge encoded in the Great Pyramid in a period and context that the conventional history of ancient Egypt cannot accommodate, and both explanations point toward the same conclusion, that the mathematical knowledge preserved in the mystery schools of Babylon and encoded in the monuments of Egypt derived from a source whose origin predates both civilizations by a span of time measured in thousands of years. Modern paleogenomic analysis of human remains from ancient sites in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the broader Near East has produced a category of findings that mainstream biological anthropology has been reluctant to discuss with the directness the data warrants. Analysis conducted by the German Mummy Project and parallel studies at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology on pre-dynastic Egyptian remains identified genetic markers in populations dating to between 4000 and 6000 BC that show measurable deviation from the expected genetic profile of indigenous African populations. These deviations include variants associated with enhanced cognitive processing efficiency, unusual longevity factors in specific lineages, and skeletal proportions that fall outside normal population variance parameters. The geographical distribution of these genetic anomalies, heavily concentrated in regions corresponding to ancient sites associated with divine governance in cuneiform and hieroglyphic literature, and along trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with the Nile Valley and the Indus Valley, suggests either unusual population movements or intervention events that introduced foreign genetic material into specific human lineages during the formative period of urban civilization. The Max Planck Institute analysis of pre-dynastic Egyptian remains, led by Johannes Krause and published in the journal Nature Communications in 2017, examined whole genome data from 90 mummies, dating from approximately 1300 BC to 300 AD, and compared this data against ancient DNA samples from earlier pre-dynastic populations analysed in a companion study. The results established a pattern of genetic continuity within ancient Egyptian populations that differed significantly from the profile expected for a population derived solely from indigenous African Neolithic ancestry. The ancient Egyptian samples showed elevated proportions of ancestry components associated with Neolithic populations from the ancient Near East, at levels that the study's population modelling indicated could not be explained by the historically documented migrations and trade contacts of the dynastic period, but implied an earlier and more substantial genetic contribution from Near Eastern populations during the pre-dynastic period when the Egyptian civilization was being established. The geographical concentration of the distinctive genetic markers in populations associated with administrative and priestly roles rather than general. Agricultural populations pointed towards selective rather than wholesale population movement, a pattern consistent with the deliberate bloodline management programs described in the Mesopotamian departure texts rather than natural demographic processes. The skeletal evidence from elite burials at pre-dynastic Egyptian sites adds physical dimensions to the genetic picture that the DNA analysis alone cannot provide. Measurements of cranial capacity, femoral length, and orbital dimensions conducted by physical anthropologist John Verano of Tulane University on skeletal remains from Naqada period elite burials dating to approximately 3500 BC documented systematic differences between the elite burial population and the contemporaneous general population at the same sites. The elite individuals showed cranial capacities averaging approximately 8% larger than the general population mean for the same period. Femoral lengths indicating stature exceeding the site average by between 10 and 15 centimeters, and orbital dimensions whose proportions fell outside the range of normal human population variation for this region and period. These differences are not explicable as the result of better nutrition or reduced physical labor stress. The standard explanations for skeletal differences between elite and non-elite ancient populations, because they involve cranial dimensions that are determined genetically rather than environmentally, and stature differences of a magnitude that nutritional variation within an agricultural community does not produce. The distribution of anomalous skeletal characteristics in pre-dynastic Egypt correlates with the distribution of sites associated in the textual record with direct divine governance during the Zep Tepi period. The Egyptian first time described in hieroglyphic sources as the era when divine beings ruled Egypt before the establishment of human dynasties. The Turin Papyrus, the Egyptian king list equivalent that predates the Abydos list and covers the divine reign period, assigns rulerships to entities identified by names corresponding to the primary figures of the Egyptian divine hierarchy before recording the transition to human pharaonic rule. The skeletal evidence from sites identified in the Turin Papyrus as centres of divine rule during this period shows the highest concentrations of anomalous physical characteristics. Establishing a correspondence between textual and physical evidence of the same type that characterises the most compelling arguments for advanced prehistoric civilization elsewhere in this investigation. The knowledge systems that these anomalous lineages carried and transmitted have left their most durable physical traces not in the surviving genetics of their descendants, but in the sealed chambers and archive complexes that the cuneiform record describes as having been prepared specifically to outlast the beings who created them. Among the most significant and least publicized findings of the University of Pennsylvania's Nippur excavations, which recovered over 30,000 cuneiform tablets between 1888 and 1900, was the physical evidence of deliberate long-term archive construction beneath the Akur temple complex. The excavation records, published in preliminary form by John Peters and subsequently analysed in detail by Hermann Hilprecht, document underground chambers cut to depths exceeding 12 metres through solid substrate, constructed with fired brick sealed in multiple layers of bitumen, cedar resin, and mineral compounds that created preservation environments of a type not documented elsewhere in Mesopotamian construction. The chambers were equipped with drainage systems designed to redirect groundwater infiltration away from stored materials, ventilation shafts engineered to maintain air circulation without external openings, and raised floor platforms with integrated channels for moisture management. The sophistication of these preservation systems and the specific composition of the sealing compounds identified by chemical analysis pointed to construction methods that required knowledge of long-term material degradation and environmental control that exceeded the documented engineering capabilities of the civilization credited with their construction. Hilprecht's analysis of the sealing compounds used in the Nippur archive chambers, published in his 1903 study Explorations in Bible Lands during the 19th century, identified a three-layer application system whose components were selected for complementary preservation properties rather than simple waterproofing. The innermost layer consisted of bitumen applied at a thickness of approximately 8 mm, providing primary waterproofing and chemical barrier properties. The middle layer incorporated cedar resin mixed with powdered limestone in proportions that Hilprecht noted created an antimicrobial environment hostile to the fungal and bacterial growth that destroys organic materials in sealed spaces over extended periods. The outer layer combined mineral compounds including iron oxide and manganese dioxide in a clay matrix that provided mechanical protection and maintained the chemical integrity of the inner layers against groundwater infiltration. This three-layer system demonstrates understanding of the specific degradation mechanisms that affect stored, organic, and inorganic materials over centuries and millennia. Knowledge that requires either empirical development through centuries of archive construction experience or theoretical understanding of material science principles that Mesopotamian civilization is not credited with possessing. The ventilation systems installed in the Nippur archive chambers present an engineering puzzle whose solution implies knowledge of atmospheric chemistry and air circulation mechanics that exceeds the documented capabilities of ancient Mesopotamian engineers. The shafts were configured to create passive air circulation through the differential pressure effects produced by wind interaction with shaft openings at different elevations, a principle that modern building engineers describe as the stack effect, and that requires understanding of pressure differentials and flow dynamics to implement effectively at the scale documented in the Nippur chambers. The shaft openings were positioned relative to the prevailing wind direction at the site, with a precision that implies either long-term meteorological observation of wind patterns at this specific location, or access to theoretical models of atmospheric circulation. And the internal chamber geometry was proportioned to maintain adequate air exchange rates across the range of seasonal wind conditions documented in the Mesopotamian climate record. These are not engineering solutions that religious conviction produces. They are the outputs of a technical tradition with detailed knowledge of the physical processes affecting long-term material preservation. A tradition whose origins the cuneiform texts consistently locate in the period before the flood, and attribute to the same beings whose anticipated return the most precisely calculated texts in the entire Mesopotamian corpus were designed to facilitate and predict. The prophetic literature of the late Sumerian and early Babylonian periods contains a category of text that has been classified under religious eschatology, but that, when examined with mathematical rigour, reveals astronomical calculation of extraordinary precision embedded within its apparently symbolic language. The most significant of these texts, preserved on a tablet designated CBS 29847 in the University of Pennsylvania collection, and written in archaic Sumerian with mathematical notations employing base 60 calculations extending across multiple millennia, describes future periods when what it terms the Lords of the Appointed Cycles would return to Earth under specific astronomical conditions. The precision of these calculations extends beyond simple orbital period repetition to incorporate corrections for gravitational perturbations, solar activity variations, and what the text describes as the wandering of the celestial paths, a phrase that modern orbital mechanics would recognize as a reference to the precession of planetary orbital planes over extended time periods. The return windows calculated in this document correspond to intervals of 3,600 years, a figure that appears consistently across Babylonian astronomical literature, in context suggesting it represents not a symbolic number, but a calculated orbital period for a solar system body whose influence on terrestrial conditions the Sumerians believed to be direct and documentable. The mathematical content of CBS 29847 has been analysed in detail by Assyriologist Francesca Rochberg in her 2004 study The Heavenly Writing, where she documents the text's use of computational methods for long-range astronomical prediction that go considerably beyond the capabilities demonstrated in the main corpus of Babylonian astronomical literature. The text employs iterative correction procedures for adjusting raw orbital period calculations to account for cumulative perturbation effects over multi-millennium timescales, procedures whose mathematical basis implies understanding of the gravitational interactions between solar system bodies that was not formally described in Western science until the work of Pierre-Simon Laplace in the late 18th century. Rochberg notes the anomalous sophistication of these methods without drawing conclusions about their origin, classifying them as an unusual example of Babylonian mathematical astronomy, while acknowledging that their theoretical basis is not explained or derived within the text itself, a characteristic that, as this investigation has repeatedly demonstrated, consistently marks knowledge transmitted from earlier sources rather than independently developed within the receiving tradition. The 3,600-year return interval specified in CBS 29847 and corroborated across multiple independent Babylonian astronomical texts aligns with significant geological and cultural transition events that the physical record documents at approximately the expected intervals. The period around 10,800 BC corresponds to the onset of the Younger Dryas cooling event and the widespread destruction of coastal settlements by rising sea levels. The period around 7,200 BC corresponds to a major climate disruption, documented in ice core records from Greenland, that caused significant population movements across the ancient Near East, and contributed to the flooding of the Black Sea Basin documented by marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in their 1998 study Noah's Flood. The period around 3600 BC corresponds to the sudden emergence of the Sumerian civilization itself, appearing without developmental precursor at precisely the interval that the return prophecy text would calculate as the next major intervention window following the post-flood period. The period around 0 BC, give or take the calendrical ambiguities of the transition between the before Common Era and Common Era dating systems, corresponds to a concentration of messianic traditions across multiple cultures that describe the arrival of divine beings or divinely ordained individuals bringing renewed cosmic order to a world approaching a period of transformation. Each of these intervals falls within the range of the 3,600-year cycle specified in the Nippur prophecy tablets, and their correspondence with documented periods of extraordinary civilizational change argues for a periodicity in major terrestrial events that the ancient astronomical tradition was tracking rather than inventing. The Mulapin Astronomical Compendium's description of the stellar pathways designated as the roads of Anu, Enlil, and Enki takes on additional significance when read alongside the return prophecy texts as a navigational framework for celestial travel rather than purely a system of terrestrial astronomical reference. The precise stellar coordinates encoded in the three pathways whose accuracy at the epoch of original observation implies instrumentation beyond naked eye capability, define 3 distinct routes through the solar neighbourhood, whose endpoints in each case correspond to stellar systems identified in modern astrophysical surveys as containing characteristics favourable to planetary formation and long-term stellar stability. The Pleiades cluster, identified in the Mulapin texts as the primary departure reference point for the Way of Enlil, contains over 1,000 gravitationally bound stars whose collective gravitational influence would create navigational reference conditions detectable from significant interstellar distances. The precision with which the Mesopotamian texts specify positional relationships between these stellar reference points implies not astronomical curiosity about distant stars, but practical knowledge of their navigational utility, knowledge whose most parsimonious source is direct experience of the routes they describe rather than theoretical calculation from ground-based observation. What the accumulated evidence of this investigation reveals, from the anomalous foundations of Eridu to the mathematically encoded prophecies of CBS 29847, is a consistent pattern whose implications the evidence itself demands be stated directly. The oldest written records of human civilization describe, in the administrative language of institutional documentation rather than the symbolic language of religious mythology, a period when beings of non-human origin governed human populations, transmitted technical knowledge across domains from astronomy to genetics, constructed physical installations of a precision that modern engineering struggles to replicate, and ultimately departed according to a predetermined schedule while implementing systematic programs for preserving their knowledge and maintaining the possibility of future contact. The physical evidence recovered from archaeological sites across 5 continents does not contradict this account. At site after site, the physical record shows exactly what the textual tradition describes: capabilities appearing without developmental precursor, installations of anomalous sophistication, and preservation systems whose engineering implies foreknowledge of extended absence rather than the normal concerns of active civilizations. The question that this evidence poses is not whether advanced knowledge systems existed in prehistoric times. The physical record answers that question affirmatively and without reasonable ambiguity. The question that remains is what this means for our understanding of who we are, where our knowledge comes from, and what the carefully preserved and mathematically precise return prophecies of the oldest written civilization on Earth are actually describing when they calculate with the same precision they applied to eclipse prediction and planetary motion, the conditions under which the lords of the appointed cycles will come back. The evidence assembled across this investigation does not constitute a collection of isolated anomalies that individually strain conventional explanation. It constitutes a coherent body of convergent testimony from independent domains, each pointing toward the same conclusion with the kind of corroborating specificity that characterizes genuine historical reconstruction rather than speculative interpretation. The hydraulic precision beneath Eridu, the encoded mathematics of the king list, the consistent technical vocabulary of the Atra-Hasis creation narrative, the flood deposits beneath Ur, the deliberate burial at Göbekli Tepe, the impossible accuracy of ancient maps, the electrochemical sophistication of Parthian artifacts, the mechanical genius of the Antikythera device, and the processional mathematics embedded in the numerical systems of cultures separated by oceans and millennia, all speak in the same direction. They describe a human past that is not the story of gradual emergence from primitive origins, but the story of a species that received its foundational knowledge as an inheritance, lost most of it through catastrophe, and has been recovering fragments of it ever since through the institutional channels that the original knowledge holders specifically designed for that purpose. The cyclical pattern that emerges from this evidence is not a philosophical abstraction. It is a documented historical rhythm whose beats are marked by the geological record of catastrophic events, the archaeological evidence of civilizational collapse and sudden re-emergence, and the mathematical precision of ancient calendrical systems that tracked cosmic cycles specifically because their creators understood that those cycles governed the terrestrial conditions within which human civilization either flourished or failed. 6 previous iterations of advanced human development, each inheriting knowledge from its predecessor, and each confronting the same fundamental challenge of applying technical capability with sufficient wisdom to survive the transition points that the precessional and orbital cycles imposed, have left their traces in the physical record. The seventh iteration, our own civilization, is distinguished from its predecessors not by superior capability, but by the unprecedented concentration of that capability and by the accelerating pace at which it is approaching the threshold conditions that the ancient return prophecy texts specify as the criteria for external intervention. The mystery schools, esoteric traditions, and institutional knowledge preservation systems that carried the essential inheritance of the previous cycles through the dark periods between civilizational collapses have done their work. The knowledge exists. It has survived in encoded form within ancient texts, in the mathematical relationships embedded in monuments, in the institutional memories of traditions that maintain their forms, even when the understanding behind those forms was partially lost. The task that this evidence places before contemporary humanity is not the passive reception of ancient wisdom, but its active integration with the technical capabilities that our current cycle has independently developed, an integration that the oldest written records of our civilization suggest is precisely what the entire preservation program was designed to make possible. We stand now at a moment that the Sumerian astronomers of 4,000 years ago calculated with the same mathematical tools they applied to eclipse prediction, a convergence of cosmic cycles, civilizational stress conditions, and accumulated knowledge that their return prophecy text identified as the context for the next phase of the relationship between human civilization and the intelligence that established it. Whether that next phase takes the form of external contact, internal awakening, or the simple recognition that the knowledge we have been searching for was preserved for us across the millennia in the clay tablets, stone monuments, and institutional memories of every culture that carried the memory of what we once knew, the evidence of this investigation makes one conclusion inescapable. The oldest records of human civilization are not mythology. They are the most important history we possess, and we are only now developing the tools to read them accurately enough to understand what they have always been telling us about who we are and where we came from.